when people say there's no coercive force, there's this idea of this leveling the playing field. But there's this overriding kind of pessimism over the past 9 months that international law really doesn't mean anything. There's this massive double standard and hypocrisy. So now, in the simplest terms, now that this ruling has come forward, do you see this affecting anything going forward? Do you see this putting pressure on Israel to actually make change, or the Western governments that basically flout their virtuous adherence to the rules-based order changing in any ways? Because we're looking for performative effect. Like, yes, legally this does have a lot of weight, but do you see any performative effect happening because of this?
Yeah, I think I would start by challenging sort of the premise there in terms of one of the unfortunate functions of United States militarism and Israeli militarism is the effect that it has on its population. And it's sort of necessary to convince the population that they are unstoppable, that nothing stands in the way of their imperialistic might. Mm-hmm. And therefore, that no international institutions can hold them accountable. And to go back to what we mentioned before about lawfare, that includes delegitimizing international law. Now, it's very obvious. This is very obvious when it comes from the government. But as you mentioned, this pessimism, even those who are progressive are like, oh, international law doesn't do anything. But I would point out that's actually a very American perspective, because it's a very pessimistic perspective that comes from existing in a country where you're constantly bombarded with messages that international law is useless. And that's not just on the right, that's also on the left. It's useless. And I get it, because it comes from a sense of frustration that no one can stop the United States, because you're constantly being told no one can stop us. And so when you see that these international organizations aren't stopping genocide, you think, well, they're useless. And I would just really caution against that attitude, because what that necessarily assumes is that courts exist to prevent or halt crime. And that's not why they exist. That is a perspective that buys into this very carceral idea of enforcement, police, cops. And that's why I caution against it for those who are trying to, reinvigorate their radical imagination as what kind of better world can we live in, is that the aim is not enforcement. We shouldn't think of it that way, because if we're going to focus always on enforcement, we're always going to need cops, we're always going to need military, we're always going to need people doing the enforcing, which just makes the enjoyment of human rights for everyone harder. So I would first say that, we need to reset our attitudes a bit. The second thing I would say is that the use of the passive voice is very interesting, because we're always told it's not enforceable or it's non-binding, and it's reported on that, this doesn't have any teeth, as you mentioned, or it's not enforceable or it can't be enforced. And I would say that's the wrong way to put it, because if we're speaking technically, no court can enforce their own judgments. That's sort of the point of separation of powers. The court makes the decision and then the state has to enforce it somehow. Or may not even be the state. It might be a private party who wins a civil claim. It might be the revenue service. So no court in the world can enforce its own judgment. So to say, well, this isn't, the ICJ doesn't have an army or the ICJ doesn't have a police force is a ridiculous thing to say, because no court does. And what it's meant to do is to take the focus off the fact that it's actually not about whether or not the decision is enforceable. The question is, who's supposed to be bound by it? And if we look at the UN Charter and we look at Article 94, the first thing that Article 94 says is that each member of the United Nations undertakes to comply with a decision of the International Court of Justice. So by shifting the focus to, it's not enforceable, completely overlooks that actually any member state of the United Nations has a duty, first and foremost, to uphold it. So it's not the obligation of the court to enforce it. It's the obligation of the state to actually comply with it. And if they fail to do so, and this is a point that almost never gets mentioned in American and Israeli media, is that Article 94.2 of the UN Charter says that if they fail to do that, that the matter can be referred to the Security Council for additional measures. Mm-hmm. And then again, we hit this pessimism. People say, oh, well, the US is on the Security Council, they just veto. But the UN can do a lot of things. Bear in mind that the UN is not this homogenous, separate, supranational world government that it's often played off as being in conspiracy theories. It's a community of states. So in the same way that states have to find ways to reflect the impact of judgments in their laws. So do the states. And there are so many mechanisms that exist other than enforcement with military and police. A major one is sanctions regimes. The UN has a sanctions regime. The Security Council can decide to list organizations as being sanctionable. They created a blacklist of organizations that were complicit in violating the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Israel. They also can order sanctions at Security Council level. And beyond that, I think we also need to look at the effect that this judgment has for all the countries around the world that aren't the US and Israel, that have domestic mechanisms that allow them to enforce the judgment. Because what we're talking about is genocide. We're talking about apartheid. These are international crimes, and they have a special status under international law, which says we recognize these crimes are so bad that anyone can basically take action to prevent them and enforce them. Any country has standing if nothing is being done about them.
That's an interesting point that I never hear it get brought up. It's like, okay, it's not enforceable. The United States is not going to enforce it. Britain is not going to enforce it. But that doesn't mean other countries won't. And that's when we see this thrust towards pariah statehood and isolation that does take a long time. Like, the Olympics are coming up. South Africa couldn't participate in the Olympics for like 20 years. This isolation does take a long time to normalize, to mount, and to in some ways formalize. So that's something that never gets brought up, and that's an interesting point to bear in mind going forward. And now, I think at Harvard, you told me you were taught by a former IDF legal official, so I'm sure you have some like unique insights into how they wage this lawfare, as you were saying. And we can see that like some of these talking points, like it's not enforceable, are part of that. But it seems like from the layman's perspective that they make a bunch of sweeping statements about international law, which aren't necessarily true. And they do this in order to undermine the international humanitarian law system, thereby get away with whatever crimes that they want. So it seems like now that this ruling has come forward from the ICJ, that they are an occupation and that they are guilty of the crime of apartheid. The Western leaders are now kind of in this predicament where they support Israel no matter what. But if they continue on the status quo, they're just at risk of undermining publicly the entire rules-based order. And so I'm wondering, like, what your opinion is on that. Like, will they actually try to follow this ruling, or will they just obfuscate the situation more and kind of hem and haw and really not do anything, and thereby, underline the hypocrisy of Western values that's been going on for the next 9 months? Do you see this changing anything in terms of their stance?
Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor's remarks, he said that when he was investigating and was told no, that the ICC is just for Africa and war criminals like Putin. I think another thing that what we're seeing that as much as there is pessimism, I actually have a lot of optimism for probably the first time in my international law career, because what we're seeing people from the global south, people who were living under apartheid, who were from colonized countries, who were brought up with the promise of Western human rights and Western ideals and believed them. And we're like, well, okay, you created these laws, you created these systems to benefit the West, by the way, but let's take you at your word and let's make them apply to everybody. And that's what we're seeing now. And that's why I think we're seeing this big, temper tantrum from the United States and Israel, is because they have created, the noose for their own neck, because they made these laws. They made international law. This has all been created since the end of the Second World War. This is all precedent that was created by, the US and Israel. And now the people who they sold the dream to, in their former colonies and in the global south, are saying, okay, well, now we're going to hold you accountable. And I think that's incredible. I think that's an incredible thing to be excited about, to see South African lawyers, standing up for justice in the International Court of Justice. The ICC prosecutor that Israel spent 5 years harassing to drop the case, is from the smallest country in Africa. And she remains steadfast in her mission. And, I think this pessimism, this idea that international law is not effective or it's useless, I think this is very localized to countries like the US, where the government benefits from this idea that international law is not useful, because outside that context, people are very hopeful about international law, realistic about it's not going to save us, right? But it's just one tool. And the great thing about international law, the great thing about having international law standards is that despite our religions, cultures, ethnicities, morals, ethics, it's a universal standard for everyone. We can sort of, apply it everywhere. And I think ultimately that's what Israel and the US fear, is they fear it being applied to them. And that's certainly what we see from Israel. And, if I could just go back to the point that you mentioned about being binding and not enforceable, I always say with these things, as much as we become disillusioned with, the ability of these institutions to stop genocides or whatever, I would say look at Israel's behavior. Okay. So, for example, Israel has spent 5 years and millions of dollars to get the head of Mossad to harass the ICC prosecutor not to investigate Israel. So my question to you and to, all your listeners is, why would they do that if they didn't feel intimidated by the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court? There's something there that scares them, because otherwise, purely from an investment point of view, you can't justify that investment. There's some reason, because if they genuinely thought that these courts had no teeth, they had no power, they'd go, say what you want, we don't care. What's it got to do with us? But they don't. They are engaged in the system because they know that they have to be engaged in the system to have any form of legitimacy.